Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about how you can actually make a useful figure with appropriate captions and include it into a scientific style paper. Now, this isn't arcane science, but there is some good rules you should make sure to follow. So, one of the first big things is just remembering that turns out text isn't always the best way to communicate all information. As they say, sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. And this is one of the big reasons why we tend to include a lot of figures into our papers. Now, one of the big things is knowing when you should use a figure. So the big thing is we're often using figures or tables if either data is inherently visual, which is a very common thing when dealing with organic chemistry. Organic reactions are, by their nature, visual often depicted with visual representations. But there's also a lot of lab data that is just a lot of numbers. And so that's often best incorporated in things like tables or graphs or plots. So one of the big things is remembering that don't try and use a figure when you only have a couple of points to imply. In those cases, it can be best to just go ahead and use it in text. But if you do have a lot of numbers or something that's visual, this is where we need our figures. Now, one of the biggest things you should remember is whenever you're writing a paper, your figures should be able to stand independently from the text. Because one of the most common tricks that people will do, and you've probably already done it, when reading a scientific paper, you maybe read the abstract, you'll look at the figures, maybe read the conclusions, and that's it. So you need to make sure that your figures can, alongside their captions, can stand independently. But there's also some people who, like me, will just read the text and skim over the figures. So you have to make sure when you're writing, the text can also stand independently. So this also means that when you're referencing figures in the text, you should make sure to incorporate the major take-home points in the text. So keeping that in mind, can you read each of these independently from each other is always a big point. So one of the big things is that, again, it should be possible to read a paper without including the other section. Now let's go ahead and look a little bit more at how we connect these two. So one of the big things to remember is that if you do include a figure, it should be referenced at some point in the text. One of the quickest things I'm going to be looking for is the figure that isn't cited in the text, because that means it probably shouldn't belong. Which then gets you, how do you cite a figure in your main paragraph? So one of the big things is that, remember, you should already have a narrative for which the figure supports. This means that you're often going to be discussing your data on its own. And then at the very end, you'll just say, to see this, go ahead and look in figures 1 or 2. So figures 1 or 2 just show what I'm talking about. This is often another form is if you got a spectra, you'll go ahead and say that we took a spectra, and you can see that in figure 2. Or you'll go ahead and say you analyze your data in a plot in figure 3. So again, note here that we kind of have these kind of subnotes. One of the common features is that we literally will include the figure citation in parentheses, showing that it does really stand independently, but it does illustrate what I'm talking about. Now, it is worth noting that in each of these cases, the next sentence should be talking about and summarizing the findings in these figures. So again, really illustrating this independent connection. Now, what will cause you to lose a point is if you just simply point to a figure and say, hey, look, figure 3 shows this. You should never, ever start a sentence with a figure citation. The figure citation is just supporting evidence for your point. So always keep this in mind. Now, let's talk about the major types of figures, because there are several big ones we have. So the classic is the general picture. So for this case, we are going to call these figures, and they should have a caption placed directly below the figure, and it should give enough information so that you can interpret every feature of this figure. And sometimes this will be simply enough to say that this is a diagram of something I'm talking about. but sometimes it can require a lot of interpretation and maybe even a couple of, maybe even showing that I adapted it from an external source, because I may not have something unique. I may have a picture of a molecule that I took from the lab manual. You need to make sure to include that in a proper citation. Now, one of the other major types of figures we have is graphs. So, big thing, graphs tend to have a little bit of their own rules. First of all, in chemical writing, you shouldn't have a title for any of your graphs. Instead, all we have is going to be a figure caption. So into this caption or into the figure itself, you should have some legend if you've got multiple types of points to make it very clear of what's what, so that I can easily interpret the data. And if you're doing any linear fits, make sure you include the full equation, oftentimes with any statistics, but most importantly, I should never see any X or Y variables. So it should always be whatever your Y-axis is versus your X-axis. I should never, ever see a Y equals X equation into your captions. Again, all of your equations, all your fitting equations should show up in the figure caption, and again, with your actual variables. Now, one of the big things, and this will often show up in scientific and chemical papers, is you're going to need to reference chemical structures. So these often show up in figures, and these are inherently visual, so they're always a good thing to include. But I do want to make note that this can be a good chance to introduce a shorthand naming system, where you have the shorthand name for any relevant complexes. But do note that you should fully name any of these complexes and designate who A, B, C, and D are by name in the main text. But this gives us a chance to really see how each of these structures differ, especially when we're comparing multiple species. Now, one of the other things that is a classic of organic chemistry is reaction schemes. So for reaction scheme, we're looking at addition of reactants to produce products. This can often take place in multiple steps and can go on quite a ways. You're probably starting to see some of these in class. So whenever you're citing a scheme, these ones actually are going to have a title placed directly beneath the image, often where we have a caption, and make sure that this title briefly, again, we don't want it to be too long, gives context for what I'm looking at. So often this is going to be a synthesis or reaction or a mechanism of whatever I'm specifically looking at. Now, the real bread and butter of the next couple of the figures for the current lab are going to be tables. Tables are often very useful when you've got large amounts of data that you're trying to summarize. So, big couple things you should note when you're looking at tables is that these are actually going to have a title instead of a caption, and that title goes above the table instead of below. Now, again, we're going to try and make this title rather succinct, a little short, and it should go ahead and give me what information is, summarize what information is in the table, so that I should be able to interpret it. Now, if this is not enough, if I'm dealing with very complicated data with specific types of collections, especially when I need to designate how each of these specific columns are different, in this case, you may need to include some extra labels and maybe even captions below. But do note that each of these captions should reference very specific points in the graph. So these are often denoted by superscripts, either in 1, 2, 3 formation, or often ABC to designate them from exponentials, so you can see exactly what I'm pointing to in each time. So for most of your for most of what we're doing for now, you should be able to get by without too many captions. But if you find that your title is getting a little too large, there's a little bit too much going on the table, these are something that you can use. So this should prep you for how to write tables for most of your scientific papers for the near future. So hopefully this helps, and see you in lab.